Chapter 1. Introduction: Money, Trust, and the Fragility of Currencies. Money is more than just a medium of exchange. It is a symbol of trust, an invisible bridge between people who do business with each other without knowing each other personally. When we receive a bill or place a coin in our hands, we trust that this piece of paper or metal will be accepted by everyone, that it will have the same value tomorrow as it does today. This trust is the very foundation of any currency. But what happens when this trust is broken? History knows numerous examples of inflation and currency devaluation, but few have left such deep marks as the hyperinflation in Germany in 1923. It became a historical trauma that went far beyond the economic realm. It destroyed not only savings, incomes, and livelihoods, but also trust in the state, society, and democracy. Millions of people experienced how their hard-earned fortunes became worthless within a few weeks or even days. The hyperinflation of 1923 was not only an economic phenomenon, but a social, cultural, and political event. It shaped the collective memory of the Germans and acted as a shock that reverberated for decades. Anyone who knows the pictures of people who went to the bakery with wheelbarrows full of banknotes to buy a loaf of bread understands the absurdity of that time. Banknotes became waste, stoves were heated with bundles of Reichsmark, or children were allowed to play with the worthless notes. But behind these grotesque scenes was a bitter reality. Inflation was the result of a combination of war burdens, reparations demands, political instability, and bad economic decisions. It led to the impoverishment of broad strata, social division, and political radicalization. For many Germans, 1923 became the year of material and moral collapse. At the same time, hyperinflation was a lesson about the fragility of money and about the role of the state. Because money is not a law of nature, but a social agreement that only lasts as long as it seems credible. When the government started printing money to finance the state budget and pay for the resistance to the occupation of the Ruhr, this fragile balance got out of control. In this script, we want to look at the hyperinflation of 1923 in all its facets, its causes, its course, its effects, and its consequences. We will see how the Weimar Republic came to the brink of collapse just a few years after its founding, and how it nevertheless found a way to stabilize. We will look at the fate of the people who lived during that time and understand why the memory of 1923 continued to have a long impact right up to the political catastrophes of the 1930s. The story of hyperinflation is a story of hope and disappointment, of courage and despair, of numbers and of fates. It shows how closely intertwined business and politics are, and how quickly the trust that forms the basis of every society can be destroyed. Chapter 2. Germany after the First World War: Initial Situation and Burdens. When the weapons of the First World War finally fell silent in November 1918, Germany was faced with a pile of shards. 4 years of a murderous war had claimed millions of lives, drained the economy, and torn the country politically and socially apart. The military defeat not only brought the end of the empire, but also the beginning of a new, uncertain era, the Weimar Republic. The starting position was very difficult. The country was marked by hunger, poverty, and despair. The British naval blockade, which lasted until the end of the war, had severely affected the supply of food and raw materials. In the cities, there was a lack of heating fuel, clothing, and food. The turnip winters of 1916-17 in particular had left deep wounds. People felt abandoned by politics and hoped for a quick improvement after the end of the war, but these hopes were not fulfilled. Economically, the empire was on the ground. The war had devoured enormous sums, which had been financed to a large extent by loans and the printing press. The mark had already depreciated considerably during the war. Gold backing had been abandoned, the Reichsbank issued vast amounts of paper money, and prices had risen sharply. Many people hoped that the situation would return to normal after the end of the war, but the burdens of defeat made this impossible. Politically, chaos reigned. The Kaiser had fled, and the Revolution of 1918–19 had produced workers' and soldiers' councils that dominated events in many cities. At the same time, a new National Assembly was formed in Weimar, which drafted the first democratic constitution in Germany. Between revolutionary hopes, monarchist longings, and the fear of a communist overthrow, the young republic had to assert itself. The terms of the Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, weighed particularly heavily. He imposed high reparation payments on Germany, limited the military, and took colonies and parts of its territory from the Reich. For many Germans, the treaty was a disgrace that deeply wounded national pride. At the same time, the reparations demands weighed like a millstone on the already weak economy. Thus, after 1918, Germany was overwhelmed in several respects. It had to pay off war debts, make reparation payments, secure the supply of the population, and at the same time build a new democratic order. The inflation that had begun during the war continued because the state continued to spend more money than it earned. The currency lost value, and people began to lose confidence in the Reichsmark. In addition, there were social tensions. Millions of soldiers returned from the war, often traumatized and without work. Unemployment, housing shortages, and hunger led to unrest. Strikes and political murders dominated the image of the early Weimar years. Right-wing and left-wing extremists tried to overthrow the new republic. This starting point is crucial for understanding the later hyperinflation of 1923. Germany began the 1920s not with a stable foundation, but with a heavy burden of war, defeat, reparations, and internal disintegration. Economic weakness and political instability formed the breeding ground on which the catastrophe of inflation could grow. So, the history of hyperinflation does not begin in 1923, but already in the years after the war. This already shows how closely political decisions, economic constraints, and the trust of the population are intertwined, and how fragile a state can be when its foundations are shaken from the start. Chapter 3. The Treaty of Versailles and its Economic Consequences. No document has shaped the history of the Weimar Republic as much as the Treaty of Versailles. Signed on 28 June 1919 in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, it became a symbol of humiliation for many Germans. Politically, he stood for forced defeat. Economically, for a huge burden that was to shake the country in the coming years. To understand the hyperinflation of 1923, one must take a close look at the role of this treaty. The Allies, especially France and Great Britain, saw Germany as the main culprit for the outbreak of war. The notorious Article 231 of the treaty, the so-called War Guilt Clause, declared Germany and its allies to be the sole culprits of the First World War. On this basis, reparations were demanded, plunging the country into years of financial servitude. The amount of the reparations was not initially precisely determined, but was later set at 132 billion gold marks. This sum was astronomical. It far exceeded Germany's economic capacity. In addition, payments had to be made in hard currency or in kind: coal, wood, industrial products. Precisely those goods that Germany would have urgently needed for reconstruction. The treaty also weakened the empire considerably in terms of territory. Alsace-Lorraine went to France, West Prussia and Poland to Poland, Eupen-Malmedy to Belgium. The Saar region was placed under League of Nations administration, and its coal mines were handed over to France. In addition, Germany lost all its colonies. This eliminated important sources of raw materials and sales markets. Militarily, Germany was drastically restricted. The Reichswehr was only allowed to comprise 100,000 men, and heavy weapons, tanks, planes, and submarines were prohibited. These provisions weakened not only the defense capability, but also the economy, as entire industries lost their production base. The psychological effect of the Treaty of Versailles could hardly be overestimated. For the German population, it became a diktat of shame. The government in Weimar, which had to sign it, lost a large part of its legitimacy as a result. Nationalists and right-wing radicals used the rejection of the treaty to delegitimize the young republic. Economically, the contract led to a double burden. On the one hand, Germany had to pay enormous sums to the Allies, and on the other hand, it lost important resources and territories. In order to meet the reparations demands, the government had little choice but to take out loans and use the printing press. This laid the foundation for inflation, which escalated in the following years. In addition, the Treaty of Versailles created a climate of constant uncertainty. The Allies retained the right to impose sanctions on Germany in the event of late payment. This threat hung like a sword of Damocles over the economy. Any political crisis could trigger the victor's seizure of German resources, as actually happened in 1923 during the occupation of the Ruhr. The Treaty of Versailles was therefore more than just a peace treaty. He was an economic and political straitjacket that shackled Germany and undermined the stability of the Weimar Republic from the beginning. Its economic consequences increased inflation, its psychological effects promoted radicalization. In the eyes of many Germans, it was the starting point for the national misery of the 1920s and a symbol of the injustice that, in their opinion, sowed the seeds of new conflicts. Chapter 4. Reparations and the Question of Solvency. The reparations imposed on Germany in the Treaty of Versailles were at the heart of the economic crisis that culminated in the hyperinflation of 1923. They were not only an enormous financial burden, but also a permanent point of contention between Germany and the Allies. The question of whether and how Germany could pay it all determined the political agenda of the Weimar Republic in its early years. After the Treaty of Versailles, the amount of reparations had initially remained undetermined, but the Allies soon agreed on gigantic sums. In 1921, the so-called London Conference was held, which set the total debt at 132 billion gold marks. Of this, about 2 billion gold marks were to be paid annually in cash or in kind, in addition to a percentage of German export revenues. The German governments, first under Reichschancellor Fehrenbach, later under Wirth and Kuno, were faced with an almost insoluble task. The country was economically devastated, industry had to be rebuilt after the end of the war, and trade relations had collapsed. Nevertheless, the Allies expected punctual payments. France, in particular, pushed for strict implementation, as it itself had high war debts to Great Britain and the USA. Germany tried several times to delay or renegotiate the payments. Reference was made to the actual inability to pay the required sums. Some politicians even hoped that the Allies would eventually realize that their demands were unrealistic. But this hope was not fulfilled. Whenever Germany defaulted, the Allies threatened sanctions and made use of this means of pressure. The burden of reparations had direct consequences for German fiscal policy. To make the payments, the government resorted to the printing press. Paper marks were printed to buy gold and foreign currency, which could be used to pay the reparations installments. This practice visibly weakened the currency. Early on, economists warned that inflation could spiral out of control. But the government saw no way out: either pay in print or risk an international crisis. At the same time, the reparation payments led to a deep division in German society. Many citizens felt it was unjust and unbearable. Right-wing parties and nationalists used the discontent to delegitimize the Weimar Republic. Fulfillment policy became a dirty word. Anyone who was willing to compromise with the Allies was considered a traitor to the fatherland. This mood radicalized politics and made a rational solution more difficult. Internationally, too, the question of reparations became a permanent conflict. While the U.S. took a more moderate stance, France pushed for tough measures. The mistrust between the former war opponents remained great. Again and again, there were negotiations, attempts at compromise, and threats, until the situation finally escalated in 1923, and France occupied the Ruhr area together with Belgium.
The reparation payments were therefore not only a financial burden, but also a political explosive barrel. They tied German fiscal policy to the printing press, undermined confidence in the currency, and increased domestic political instability. Without them, the hyperinflation of 1923 would probably not have existed in this form. Chapter 5: The Political Crises of the Early Weimar Republic. The young Weimar Republic had to contend not only with economic problems, but also with political instability that threatened the foundations of the new state. After the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II in November 1918 and the proclamation of the Republic, Germany found itself in a state of upheaval that was characterized by insecurity, violence, and deep social divisions. These political crises formed the background against which inflation continued to worsen. The revolution of 1918-19 already showed the tensions between different political camps. On one side were the moderate forces, the Social Democrats, the Center, and the Liberals, who wanted to build a parliamentary democracy. On the other side were radical groups, communists who wanted to establish a Soviet republic based on the Soviet model, and nationalists who longed for the monarchy or preferred authoritarian structures. The clashes led to a series of bloody uprisings. The Spartacus uprising in January 1919, led by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, was brutally suppressed by government troops and the Freikorps. In the following years, there were further uprisings, such as the Munich Soviet Republic or the communist uprisings in the Ruhr area. On the right, there were coup attempts, such as the Kapp Putsch in 1920, in which Freikorps tried to overthrow the government. Although the coup failed due to the general strike of the workers, it showed how fragile the democratic order was. The violence of the early Weimar years was omnipresent. Political murders shook the country. The Reich Foreign Minister Walther Rathenau was murdered by right-wing extremists in 1922, as was Matthias Erzberger, the signatory of the Armistice of 1918. These attacks were not only attacks on individuals, but on the legitimacy of the republic itself. In addition, there was the permanent weakness of the governments. Coalitions often broke up. Cabinets often lasted only a few months. The Reichstag elections brought about a fragmentation of the party landscape, so that stable majorities were difficult to achieve. The democratic parties had to constantly defend themselves against attacks from the left and right, while the population became increasingly dissatisfied. This political instability intensified the economic crisis. Governments have hardly been able to pursue long-term fiscal and economic policies. Emergency solutions determined action, and money was repeatedly printed to cover short-term expenses. Inflation was not only an economic symptom, but also a political one. It reflected the inability of governments to create stable structures. At the same time, inflation brought people closer to the political fringes. Those who lost their savings or were crushed by the price explosion looked for radical solutions. Communists promised a break with the capitalist system, nationalists the restoration of national strength. Both sides benefited from the failure of the democratic center, which, in the eyes of many citizens, offered no answers to the crisis. The early political crises of the Weimar Republic were therefore more than just side effects. They formed the breeding ground on which hyperinflation in 1923 was able to unleash its destructive power. Without the distrust in the government, without the radicalization of society, and without the permanent instability, the economic catastrophe might have been easier to contain. But in this way, the political and economic crises reinforced each other and led the Republic to the brink of the abyss. Chapter 6: First Signs of Inflation, 1919 to 1921. The hyperinflation of 1923 seemed like a sudden collapse, but its roots go back to the first years after the First World War. As early as 1919 and 1921, there were clear signs of inflation that was becoming increasingly difficult to control. In this phase, the catastrophe was being prepared that would later strike Germany with full force. Already during the war, the German Reich had financed its expenditures not through taxes, but primarily through debt and the printing press.
Gold marks were no longer issued, and the Reichsbank instead issued paper money in ever larger quantities. After the end of the war, the money supply remained at a high level, and the government continued this practice to cover the enormous costs of demobilization, the care of war invalids, and surviving dependents. The result was a continuous decline in the value of money. As early as 1919, prices rose significantly, and the purchasing power of the mark began to decline. Although there was no talk of hyperinflation at the time, the population was already noticing that money was no longer as stable as it was before the war. Workers demanded higher wages to compensate for the rising cost of living, and employers, in turn, passed on these costs in the form of higher prices. A vicious circle began. The mark also weakened internationally. The exchange rate against the US dollar fell rapidly. While a mark had been worth about $0.25 before the war, it now steadily lost value. Foreign exchange speculation and the mistrust of international investors further exacerbated the development. Germany had to raise more and more paper marks in order to make reparation payments in hard currency. Unease grew among the German population. Many people began to lose their trust in the mark and looked for alternative values. Material goods such as real estate, jewelry, or precious metals were increasingly considered safer than money in the bank. Some have already spoken of the flight into tangible assets. The middle class in particular, trusting in their savings, began to feel the danger even if they could not yet foresee the full extent. Politically, inflation remained an explosive issue. The government justified the printing of money with the need to keep the state running and to meet the reparations demands. At the same time, some politicians hoped that a weak mark could boost German exports and thus stimulate the economy again. But this short-term advantage was masked by the long-term damage. By 1921, inflation had not yet gotten out of control, but it had already established itself as a permanent companion of everyday life. Prices rose at a pace that worried the population, but not yet completely desperate. No one could have guessed at the time that this development would lead to hyperinflation a few years later, which would turn the lives of millions of people upside down. The years 1919 to 1921 were thus a transitional period. The catastrophe was looming, but many still considered it manageable. Only with the escalation of international conflicts and the occupation of the Ruhr was latent inflation to turn into an uncontrollable storm. Chapter 7. The Transition to Hyperinflation, 1922. The year 1922 marked the decisive turning point. The already noticeable but still halfway controllable devaluation of money turned into an inexorable crash that finally led to the hyperinflation of 1923. During these 12 months, the Reichsmark depreciated at a rate that surprised even the most pessimistic observers. A major trigger was increasing political and economic uncertainty. The assassination attempts on high-ranking politicians, including the murder of Reich Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau in June 1922, shook confidence in the stability of the Republic. The political violence on the streets between communists and right-wing radical groups gave the impression that the state was losing its authority. In such a climate, confidence in the currency continued to wane. The question of reparations also exacerbated the situation. Germany has repeatedly had difficulties paying the required installments on time. France in particular insisted on uncompromising compliance, while British voices tended to advocate negotiations. The German attempts to achieve payment deferrals or relief failed again and again. Every failed conference, every news of an impending default caused the value of the mark to fall further. In the summer of 1922, the exchange rate began to tilt dramatically. While at the beginning of the year about 190 marks had to be paid for $1, in December it was already over 7,000. Within a few months, the price multiplied, a clear sign that the currency had lost its bottom. Merchants and citizens reacted with panic buying, knowing that the money in their pockets would be worth less the next day. Prices skyrocketed.
Food, clothing, fuel, everything became more expensive, often on a weekly basis. Those who received wages or salaries had to spend them as quickly as possible before they lost value. People began to radically change their behavior. Instead of saving money, they spent it immediately, sometimes on things they didn't need urgently, just to avoid the loss of value. International confidence in the Reichsmark was also finally gone. Foreign companies refused to be paid in marks. Contracts were only concluded in dollars, pounds, or Swiss francs. German exporters had to sell their goods far below value because no one wanted to accept the unstable currency. The Reichsbank under Rudolf Havenstein reacted with the printing press. In order to cover the state's expenditures for reparation payments, for subsidizing companies, for social benefits, it printed ever larger amounts of paper money. New banknotes with ever higher denominations were issued, first in thousands, then in hundreds of thousands, and finally in millions. But the more money came into circulation, the faster it lost value. The year 1922 was thus the transition from high but still controllable inflation to galloping devaluation. The foundations for the hyperinflation of 1923 had been laid. Confidence in the currency had been destroyed, the printing press was running at full speed, and the population had adapted its behavior to the constant devaluation of money. The storm that was now to come could no longer be stopped.
Chapter 8. The occupation of the Ruhr area in 1923, trigger and escalation. The immediate trigger of the hyperinflation of 1923 was the occupation of the Ruhr area by French and Belgian troops. This event dramatically showed how closely Germany's economic and political crisis was intertwined, and how external constraints and internal conflicts worked together to plunge the country into the abyss. The Ruhr area was the industrial heart of Germany. This is where the coal mines, steel mills, and factories were located, which were indispensable not only for the German economy, but also for reparation payments to the Allies. France, which after the war was particularly insistent on the supply of coal and steel, regarded the Ruhr area as a pledge for German obligations. When Germany defaulted on payments at the end of 1922, including for wood and coal deliveries, the French government under Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré decided to take a drastic step. On January 11, 1923, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr area and occupied the most important industrial centers. Officially, it was a pledge to force the fulfillment of the reparations payments. In reality, however, it was a show of force intended to humiliate Germany and strengthen France's position. The German government under Reichschancellor Wilhelm Kuno reacted with a call for passive resistance. Workers, civil servants, and entrepreneurs in the Ruhr area were called upon not to cooperate with the occupiers. Railroad workers refused to run trains, miners stopped working, and authorities ceased their activities. This resistance was supported and financed by the government, but it was precisely this that finally led the Reich's finances to the brink of the abyss. While production in the Ruhr area came to an almost complete standstill, the affected workers and civil servants had to continue to be paid. The state took over their wages and salaries, although no consideration was provided. These expenses could not be covered by taxes, so the Reichsbank once again resorted to the printing press. The already rapid depreciation of the mark now accelerated dramatically. The occupation also led to a spiral of escalation. France and Belgium used violence to restart production, while acts of sabotage, attacks, and bloody clashes took place in the Ruhr area. The tensions between the occupiers and the German population exacerbated the crisis. Every day of resistance cost the German state billions in additional expenditure, and every new bundle of money that came out of the printing plant further eroded the value of the mark. However, the occupation of the Ruhr had not only economic but also psychological consequences. For many Germans, it was a national humiliation that intensified hatred of France. At the same time, it reinforced the feeling that the Weimar Republic was incapable of protecting the country. Radical parties used the crisis to attack the government.
While communists rejected the resistance as a capitalist staging, nationalists accused the Republic of weakness and betrayal. The occupation of the Ruhr in 1923 was thus a catalyst for hyperinflation. Without them, the devaluation of the mark might have been less explosive. But the combination of passive resistance, production shutdowns, and state-financed wage losses caused the money supply to explode to an extent that no longer allowed for control. A fire turned into a conflagration that almost completely destroyed confidence in the currency and in the Republic.
Chapter 9. Passive Resistance and the Cost to the State. Passive resistance in the Ruhr area is considered one of the central factors that fueled the hyperinflation of 1923. What at first glance may appear to be a patriotic gesture of unity towards the French and Belgian occupation turned out in practice to be an unbearable financial burden for the already shaken Weimar Republic. When the Kuno government called for resistance in January 1923, millions of workers, employees, and civil servants followed him. Trains stopped, mines were shut down, administrations refused to cooperate with the occupiers. This boycott hit the French and Belgian troops hard, because without the cooperation of the locals, it was impossible to simply let the huge industrial production of the Ruhr area continue. Politically, this initially showed a rare unity between workers, employers, and the state. But this unity came at a price. Anyone who went on strike or refused to work in the Ruhr area still had to be cared for. The government undertook to continue paying wages and salaries of workers and civil servants. Month after month, billions of marks flowed into the region, without a single ton of coal being mined or a kilogram of steel being produced. The state thus financed an entire region that was economically paralyzed. In addition, there were the costs of supporting families, transporting goods from other regions, and supplying the population. The sabotage actions against the occupiers, some of which were carried out by paramilitary groups, also caused further expenses. Within a few months, government spending rose immeasurably. Since tax revenues collapsed dramatically during this time, after all, the country's most important industrial area was at a standstill, the government had only one way out. It let the Reichsbank print more and more paper money. The printing presses ran day and night to put the billions of required mark notes into circulation. Passive resistance thus drove inflation into a new dimension. At the same time, this policy had a fatal psychological effect. The population outside the Ruhr area saw how the state spent money in streams without any recognizable reciprocal service. Many began to completely lose confidence in the stability of the currency. More and more people are trying to exchange their market notes immediately for tangible assets, foreign currency, or gold. The faster the money was spent, the faster prices rose, a classic inflationary spiral. Despite these devastating consequences, the government held on to passive resistance for a long time. She feared that giving in to France would be interpreted as weakness and could endanger the Republic even more domestically. It was not until the autumn of 1923, when inflation had already gotten out of control, that the policy of resistance was abandoned. The passive resistance in the Ruhr area is an example of how closely politics and business are intertwined. What was considered a national duty politically turned out to be an economic disaster. Costs were beyond measure, and hyperinflation reached a dynamic that no one could stop. Chapter 10. The Money Glut. Money Printing and New Banknotes. With the escalation of passive resistance in the Ruhr area in 1923, the devaluation of money reached a level that went beyond imagination. To finance the gigantic state spending, the government resorted to its last remaining instrument, the unrestrained issuance of paper money. The printing press became the symbol of this time, and with it came a veritable flood of money over the country. In the years before, the Reichsbank had already expanded the money supply, but now the production of banknotes ran day and night. Printers worked in shifts, and soon even their capacity was no longer sufficient. Private printers, publishers, and even smaller companies were commissioned to print banknotes. The denominations became higher and higher. First, notes worth thousands of marks were put into circulation, then millions, and finally billions and trillions. The speed of currency devaluation was breathtaking. At the beginning of 1923, a dollar had cost about 18,000 marks, but in November of the same year it was over 4.2 trillion. Prices no longer rose monthly or weekly, but daily and often even hourly. In many shops, prices were rewritten several times a day. A loaf of bread that cost 200 million marks in the morning could be worth 400 million in the evening. This was a nightmare for the population. Wages were no longer paid weekly or monthly, but daily, sometimes even twice a day, so that people could shop immediately before the money continued to depreciate. Workers hurried to the shops immediately after work with bundles of money to get hold of a piece of butter or some coal. Those who waited too long had to find that their wages were worthless in the meantime. The images of that time are iconic. People with wheelbarrows full of banknotes, children playing with bundles of banknotes because they were worth less than wooden toys. Housewives dragged bags full of banknotes to the market just to buy some potatoes. Some people began to use the notes as wallpaper or to burn them in the oven because the paper was worth less than the wood with which it could have been replaced. Coins also almost completely disappeared from circulation. Even copper coins soon had a higher material value than face value, and so they were hoarded or melted down. The state therefore put emergency banknotes into circulation, some of which were printed by cities, municipalities, and companies themselves. These so-called emergency money issues were often colorfully designed and became a common currency in times of need. But despite all these measures, the decline in value could not be stopped. The more banknotes came into circulation, the faster they lost value. Hyperinflation had developed its own dynamic, which eluded any state control. Trust in the Reichsmark practically no longer existed. Instead, people oriented themselves towards stable currencies such as the dollar or the Swiss franc, which were traded on the black market for unimaginable sums of paper marks. The flood of money in 1923 was the most visible expression of the crisis. It showed that a currency is nothing more than trust, and that if this trust is lost, even mountains of paper are no longer suitable as a means of payment. The state could issue its banknotes in trillions, but for the people, they were only worthless paper.
Chapter 11. Everyday Life in Inflation: Prices, Markets, Supply. The hyperinflation of 1923 was not only an economic phenomenon that can be represented in numbers and curves, but above all an omnipresent intervention in people's daily lives. It determined what you could eat, when you shopped, how you worked, and how you tried to ensure your survival. Everyday life was dominated by the price explosion, and every family had to develop strategies to deal with the absurd situation. Prices rose so quickly that they were hardly comprehensible. A pound of bread, which cost perhaps 1,000 marks in the summer of 1923, could be worth millions just a few weeks later. Meat, milk, butter, or potatoes were hardly affordable, and even simple staple foods became luxury goods. Sellers and traders had to constantly adjust their prices. In some shops, they were rewritten several times a day or pasted over with slips of paper. This dynamic led to a complete change in everyday habits. Workers who received their wages in the morning rushed to the shops with their money immediately after work or during their lunch break because they knew that the value would have fallen again by the evening. Some companies allowed their employees to go to the shops during working hours to secure at least a few groceries. Time was literally money. The faster you spent it, the more you got for it. For housewives and families, inflation meant constant agitation. Anyone who went shopping had to carry huge bundles of banknotes with them. Handbags and purses were no longer enough. People took suitcases, backpacks, or wheelbarrows. Paying became a laborious process because counting the bills often took longer than the actual purchase. Some shops weighed the banknotes instead of counting them. The supply situation was also tense. Farmers and producers often only sold their goods in exchange for stable foreign currency or material goods because they no longer wanted to accept worthless paper marks. Barter therefore flourished on the markets. A pair of shoes could be exchanged for a few sacks of potatoes, a ring for a pound of butter. For many city dwellers, barter was the only way to get food. In the cities, people suffered especially. Rents and energy prices rose immeasurably. Coal and heating fuel were scarce. Some heated with furniture or burned worthless money in the stove because it was cheaper than firewood. In the countryside, the situation was somewhat better, as farmers could access their products directly, but there was also uncertainty and mistrust of the Reichsmark. Social life changed drastically. Anyone who went to restaurants or cafes had to reckon with the fact that the prices had doubled between ordering and payment. In some restaurants, waiters stood next to the tables with chalkboards to adjust prices in real time. Weddings, parties, or other celebrations were often canceled or only held on a small scale because the costs were incalculable. Public transport was not spared either. Trams, buses, and trains constantly increased their fares. Sometimes passengers had to pay directly in the car because the fare had already risen during the journey. Hyperinflation intervened in all areas of life and turned everyday life into a race against the loss of value. It took away not only people's money, but also a piece of security, predictability, and dignity. Every purchase, every payment of wages, every trip to work became a struggle against an invisible but unstoppable force, the devaluation of money.
Chapter 12. Winners and Losers. Speculators, entrepreneurs, workers. The hyperinflation of 1923 was not a disaster for everyone equally. While millions of people lost their savings and ended up in abject poverty, there were also groups that benefited from the situation. Inflation acted like a gigantic redistribution process. It destroyed the wealth of many and at the same time opened up opportunities for those who speculated skillfully or got rid of their debts in one fell swoop. The biggest losers were savers and the middle class. People who had accumulated small reserves in bank accounts or savings books for decades saw their assets dissolved into nothing within a few weeks. Life insurance policies, pensions, and pensions denominated in fixed payments and marks became worthless. Civil servants, teachers, and employees who lived on their monthly salaries could hardly cover their basic needs. For them, inflation meant social decline, an experience that left deep bitterness. The workforce also suffered massively. Although wages rose steadily, they were never able to catch up with the price increases. There was always a gap between wage adjustment and expenses. Trade unions fought for higher wages, but the dynamics of inflation were faster than any round of collective bargaining. Many working-class families lived on the brink of starvation and had to improvise to make ends meet. Farmers, on the other hand, found themselves in an ambivalent situation. Those who produced grain, milk, or potatoes could sell these goods at ever higher prices, often in exchange for foreign currency or tangible assets. Some farmers benefited from the fact that city dwellers offered jewelry, furniture, or clothing in exchange for food. On the other hand, they also had to buy machines, tools, and industrial goods at horrendous prices, so that the profit was often eaten up again. Clear winners were debtors. Anyone who had taken out a loan before inflation, whether for a house, a factory, or a plot of land, could now repay it with worthless money. Millions or even billions in loans disappeared into thin air in one fell swoop because the repayment was made in paper marks, which had hardly any purchasing power. In this way, many owners and entrepreneurs became debt-free in one fell swoop. Speculators and businessmen who bet on foreign exchange or tangible assets at an early stage benefited particularly spectacularly. Those who had bought dollars or Swiss francs in time could enrich themselves overnight. Likewise, those who owned real estate, precious metals, or stocks, the value of which skyrocketed with inflation, won. In the big cities, new riches were created,
while at the same time entire classes plunged into misery, a picture of extreme social inequality. Entrepreneurs who had goods in stock were often able to sell them at rising prices and convert their profits into stable values. Some companies, especially in the export industry, benefited from the fact that their products were cheap abroad due to the low exchange rate. While the domestic economy collapsed, exports boomed in certain areas. But hyperinflation had not only economic but also moral winners and losers. Many people felt that the enrichment of speculators was shameless and unjust. The inflation profiteer became the symbol of a society in which money displaced all morality. While some starved, others amassed wealth, a contrast that poisoned the social climate. Hyperinflation was therefore not only an economic crisis, but also a social upheaval. It created new elites and destroyed old structures. Above all, however, it left behind a deep division between those who had lost everything and those who came to prosperity in chaos. This experience shaped the thinking of an entire generation and nurtured mistrust of the state, the economy, and democracy. Chapter 13: The Fate of the Middle Class, the Loss of Savings. Among all social groups, it was the German middle class that was hit hardest by the hyperinflation of 1923. Civil servants, employees, small merchants, craftsmen, teachers, or academics, they had all tried to build up a certain security through thrift and diligence in the years before the First World War and also during the difficult post-war period. But inflation destroyed this life's work. Within a few months, solid savings, life insurance policies, and pensions turned into worthless paper. Many middle-class families have traditionally had a strong faith in the value of money. They invested their income in savings accounts, paid into insurance policies, or invested in government bonds. These forms of investment were considered safe, even a bourgeois virtue. But it is precisely these groups that were hit particularly hard by the devaluation of money. While entrepreneurs were able to devalue their debts and farmers had food, the middle class usually only had financial assets, and that dissolved into nothing in inflation. The fate of the pensioners was particularly tragic. Those who had paid into a pension for decades now received payments that were at best enough to buy a loaf of bread. Old people who had worked all their lives suddenly had to beg or seek refuge in the poorhouses. Even war invalids, who seemed to be secured with pensions or pensions, were left with nothing. Civil servants and employees also suffered from the constant loss of value. Although their salaries have been adjusted again and again, they have always lagged behind price increases. Even teachers or university professors who used to be respected and financially secure suddenly could hardly afford the bare necessities. Some were forced to sell books, furniture, or heirlooms to buy food. The loss of savings had not only material but also psychological consequences. The middle class, which had always relied on stability, order, and precaution, felt cheated out of the fruits of its labor. Trust in the state, which could not or did not want to protect the currency, was permanently destroyed. Many perceived this as a personal humiliation, a feeling that provoked deep resentment and later prepared the breeding ground for political radicalization. Particularly bitter was the experience that a few benefited from inflation while the majority became impoverished. Those who had invested in real estate, shares, or foreign exchange in good time were able to save or even increase their assets. For the middle class, however, which was mostly conservative and risk-averse, this had hardly been an option. This created the impression of a double injustice. One lost everything, while others became rich in chaos. This collective experience shaped the memory of an entire generation. Decades later, the fear of inflation was still deeply rooted in Germany. The middle class, which was considered the backbone of society, had lost its basis in the hyperinflation of 1923. Their descent into misery became a symbol of the collapse of security, order, and trust, and left behind a trauma that permanently weakened the Weimar Republic. Chapter 14: Culture and Society Under the Sign of Worthless Money. The hyperinflation of 1923 not only shaped the economy and politics, but also penetrated deep into cultural and social structures. It changed people's thinking, acting, and perception. Everyday life was no longer predictable. The order of values shifted, and uncertainty was reflected in art, literature, and society. In the cities, an atmosphere was created that was characterized by desperation and hectic activity at the same time. The streets were full of people standing in lines in front of bakeries and shops, while next to them, merchants offered foreign currency, cigarettes, or food on the black market. Bartering flourished. Furniture, clothing, jewelry, or books were exchanged for potatoes or coal. The value of money had disappeared, and with it the order of society seemed to be shaken. Culturally, this period was described as a dance on the volcano. While large parts of the population were struggling to survive, the big cities such as Berlin, Munich, or Frankfurt experienced a boom in nightlife. Cabarets, theaters, and dance halls filled with people trying to escape everyday life. Money that was valuable today could be worthless tomorrow, so it was spent immediately, often on pleasure, luxury, or excessive celebrations. Inflation quickly found its way into literature and art. Writers such as Erich Kästner, Thomas Mann, and Bertolt Brecht took up the themes of insecurity, decay, and social upheaval. Newspapers reported daily on the grotesque excesses of the devaluation of money. For example, of children who made kites with banknotes, or families who wallpapered their homes with banknotes. Artists of expressionism and new objectivity depicted the distorted reality in bright colors and sharp contours. Inflation also created new social patterns. While traditional values such as thrift and precaution had lost their meaning, what counted now was rapid adaptation and risk-taking. Those who speculated courageously could win, those who hesitated lost. This climate fostered a sense of moral decay. Many contemporaries complained about selfishness, indifference, and the breaking down of social barriers. The change in gender roles was particularly striking. Women, who were often in charge of the household, had to improvise daily to organize food and fuel. They stood in queues for hours, exchanged belongings, or traded at markets. Their role as providers in chaos strengthened their social significance, even if they were at the same time more burdened than before. Inflation also influenced the collective consciousness. For many people, it was a traumatic experience that destroyed confidence in the future. They had learned that everything they had worked for could be worthless in a short time. This feeling of insecurity shaped the thinking of the 1920s and contributed to a basic mood of skepticism, resignation, but also cynicism. At the same time, however, a creative energy was also created. Necessity forced inventiveness. Instability opened up scope for artistic experiments and social innovations. The Roaring Twenties, which were soon to follow, were not least a reaction to the chaos of inflation, an attempt to free oneself from the experience of economic collapse through pleasure and cultural development. The hyperinflation of 1923 was thus more than a currency crisis. It was a cultural and social earthquake that deeply affected the mentality of the people. It changed values, destroyed old certainties, and left behind a feeling of disorientation, but also an urge for new beginnings and expression that made the culture of the Weimar Republic unique.
Chapter 15: Political Radicalization from Coup Attempts to Extremism. The hyperinflation of 1923 not only affected wallets and markets, but also had a massive impact on political life. It increased tensions in the young Weimar Republic and drove many people into the arms of radical parties and movements. The feeling that the government could neither stabilize the economy nor protect the country from foreign humiliation led to a wave of disappointment, anger, and despair, an ideal breeding ground for extremists. Even before 1923, the Weimar Republic had to contend with political crises. The murder of politicians such as Walter Rathenau and Matthias Erzberger had shown that political violence was part of everyday life. But inflation exacerbated this situation even more.
Millions of people who had lost their savings or struggled to survive on a daily basis were receptive to simple answers and radical solutions. On the left, the Communist Party of Germany, KPD, gained strength. It used the need to promote a revolution based on the Soviet model. In Saxony and Thuringia, left-wing governments were formed in 1923, which worked closely with the communists. There were uprisings and strikes, some of which were bloodily suppressed. The KPD hoped for a German October, a revolution similar to the one in Russia, but it ultimately failed due to resistance from the Reichswehr and a lack of popular support. Nationalist and nationalistic groups formed on the right, interpreting inflation as proof of the failure of democracy. In Bavaria, the capital Munich developed into a gathering place for right-wing radical movements. Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, also found a growing audience there. Inflation allowed him to successfully spread his agitation against the November criminals of 1918, against the Treaty of Versailles, and against alleged guilty parties in society and politics. In November 1923, this development culminated in the so-called Hitlerputsch, also known as the March on the Feldherrenhalle. Hitler and General Erich Ludendorff tried to seize power in Munich and from there to start a coup throughout Germany. Although the coup failed miserably, the police shot down the demonstration. It showed how much inflation had radicalized the political climate. In the bourgeois camp, too, the distance to democracy increased. Many members of the middle class who had lost their livelihoods due to inflation turned their backs on the republic. They no longer saw it as the hope of a new beginning, but as the cause of their misery. As a result, Weimar democracy lost precisely the stratum that had traditionally embodied stability and order. However, inflation not only radicalized the political camps, it also weakened the center. Governments changed in rapid succession, and compromises became increasingly difficult. Trust in parliamentary solutions dwindled, while violence on the streets increased. Paramilitary associations such as the Red Hundreds of the Communists or the SA of the National Socialists dominated the streetscape in many cities. The political radicalization of 1923 was thus a direct consequence of hyperinflation. It showed that economic emergencies create not only economic but also political crises. Although the Weimar Republic survived this phase, the experience of 1923 remained a deep turning point. Many Germans lost confidence in the democratic order, and extremist movements gained a base that they were later able to expand. Chapter 16. The International Perception of German Inflation. The hyperinflation of 1923 was not an isolated German event, but was followed with great attention by international partners and former war opponents. In London, Paris, Washington, and Zurich, there was intensive discussion about the causes and consequences of the devaluation of money, and what consequences it would have for the international order. In France in particular, inflation was viewed with a mixture of mistrust and skepticism. Many French politicians, especially Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré, were convinced that Germany deliberately caused inflation in order to undermine the reparations demands. According to this interpretation, the devaluation of money was not an expression of economic hardship, but a deliberate strategy to show, look, we can't pay. For France, this was an affront that was intended to further justify the occupation of the Ruhr. In Great Britain, the situation was seen in a more differentiated way. Many British politicians and economists recognized that the reparations demands were unrealistic in their amount and overwhelmed Germany economically. John Maynard Keynes had already warned in 1919 in his work The Economic Consequences of Peace that the burdens of the Treaty of Versailles would destabilize Europe. Inflation seemed to confirm his forecasts. Nevertheless, there was also great skepticism in London as to whether Germany could not actually pay or just did not want to pay. The United States followed the crisis with growing interest, since on the one hand it wanted a stable situation as a creditor of the European states, but on the other hand, the question of reparations was closely linked to the war debts of its allies.
American observers were fascinated by the grotesque excesses of inflation. Newspapers published anecdotes about wheelbarrows full of banknotes and restaurant visits where you had to pay the bill before the meal in order not to end up paying twice as much. In the American public, Germany was often seen as a cautionary tale of what could happen when a state ruined its finances without restraint. Neutral states such as Switzerland and the Netherlands also watched the German crisis closely, as they were closely intertwined economically. Swiss banks and traders benefited in part from the flight of German assets to stable currencies, while at the same time fearing the political consequences of destabilization in Central Europe. Overall, the international perception of German inflation was ambivalent. On the one hand, there was real misery, the impoverishment of broad sections of the population, and political destabilization. On the other hand, there was a suspicion in many places that Germany was partly to blame for this crisis, whether through an irresponsible fiscal policy or through the deliberate strategy of evading reparation payments. This ambivalence had direct consequences for international politics. While France continued to rely on confrontation, the United States and Great Britain realized that a lasting solution was only possible through a reorganization of the reparations issue. This insight finally led to the Dawes Plan of 1924, which reorganized reparation payments and made currency stabilization possible. The international perception of hyperinflation made it clear that it was not only a German tragedy, but had a European and global political dimension. It influenced the relationship between the victorious powers in Germany as well as the debates about the future of the international economy. And it showed the world how destructive a currency crisis could be, an image that was deeply etched in the collective memory.
Chapter 17: Stabilization Policy, Currency Reform, and the Introduction of the Rentenmark. In the autumn of 1923, hyperinflation had reached its peak. The Reichsmark had become virtually worthless, prices were rising immeasurably every day, and the population's confidence in the currency had been completely destroyed. Without a fundamental reform, the Weimar Republic threatened to sink into chaos. In this desperate situation, however, it was possible to stabilize the currency through decisive action and gradually regain confidence. The decisive measure was the introduction of the Rentenmark in November 1923. Under the leadership of Reichschancellor Gustav Stresemann and Reich Finance Minister Hans Luther, a new currency was created to replace the devalued papermark. The architect of this reform was Hjalmar Schacht, who was appointed Reich Currency Commissioner in December 1923 and later became president of the Reichsbank. The special thing about the Rentenmark was that it was not backed by gold. Germany hardly had any gold reserves left, but by tangible assets. The basis was the so-called Rentenbank, which took out mortgages on land and industrial assets amounting to 3.2 billion gold marks. This created a fixed equivalent value. One Rentenmark was equivalent to 1 trillion paper marks and was fixed at the rate of 4.2 Rentenmarks per US dollar. It was not only the technical construction of the currency that was decisive, but the trust it evoked. The population was prepared to accept the Rentenmark because they felt that an end to the flood of money had finally been reached. The government promised not to put any more vast quantities of Rentenmarks into circulation and kept to it. Within a few weeks, the situation calmed down. Prices stabilized, wages and salaries could be paid reliably again, and trade slowly got going. Parallel to the introduction of the Rentenmark, the Stresemann government took further steps to ensure stabilization. The passive resistance in the Ruhr area was ended in order to stop the unbearable costs. Government spending was drastically cut, subsidies were cut, and strict tax policies were introduced to rebalance the budget. These austerity measures were painful but necessary to create confidence in the new currency. The Reichsbank, which had previously printed money en masse, was strengthened in its independence. Schacht ensured that it no longer became a plaything of government policy, but decided independently on the money supply. This introduced a basic principle of modern monetary policy, the separation of government and central bank.
The stabilization policy of 1923 was a balancing act. It demanded great sacrifices from the population, especially through the harsh austerity measures. But it laid the foundation for the economic recovery of the following years. As early as 1924, the Rentenmark was supplemented by the Reichsmark, which was now given a golden basis again. The introduction of the Rentenmark is still considered a masterpiece of monetary policy today. It shows that a currency is not based solely on gold or foreign exchange reserves, but above all on trust. Once that trust is restored through credible action, even the biggest crisis can turn into a fresh start. For the Weimar Republic, this reform was a lifeline. It prevented complete collapse and opened the way to the Golden Twenties, a period of relative stability and cultural flourishing. But the memory of inflation remained alive and was to shape the Germans' relationship to money and currency for decades.
Chapter 18: The Dawes Plan and International Integration. The stabilization of the currency by the Rentenmark was a first vital step, but the economic and political problems of the Weimar Republic were far from being solved. Above all, the question of reparations continued to hang over Germany like a sword of Damocles. Without an international settlement, there was a risk of a new escalation at any time, and the stability that had been painstakingly won could quickly falter again. It was in this situation that the Dawes Plan came into play, named after the American banker and politician Charles G. Dawes. It was developed in 1924 by an international committee that was supposed to reorganize Germany's solvency. The plan was not a final solution, but was intended as a transitional arrangement, but it proved crucial to calm the economy and reintegrate Germany into the international community. Key points of the Dawes Plan were reduction and staggering of reparation payments. Germany was initially supposed to pay smaller amounts, which then gradually increased. This gave the country time to recover economically. Foreign loans. Large loans flowed into Germany, especially from the USA, to get the economy going again. American banks invested billions to help modernize industry and infrastructure. International control. A reparations agent monitored the German payments and ensured that the agreed sums were actually paid. In this way, the Allies wanted to prevent Germany from evading its obligations again. Evacuation of the Ruhr area. As part of the agreement, France and Belgium undertook to withdraw their troops from the Ruhr area. This diffused a central point of conflict. The Dawes Plan acted as a liberating blow. With the foreign loans, Germany was able to boost its economy, invest in companies, and create jobs. The reparations burden was now easier to plan, and international integration strengthened confidence in the stability of the Weimar Republic. The withdrawal of the occupying troops from the Ruhr area also represented an important symbolic relief. Politically, the plan led to a phase of détente. International cooperation, especially with the USA and Great Britain, improved. After the extreme tensions of the occupation of the Ruhr, France was also prepared to take a more pragmatic course. Germany was even able to join the League of Nations in 1926, a sign that it was once again accepted into the community of nations as an equal member. But the Dawes Plan also had its downsides. The German economy became heavily dependent on foreign loans, especially from the USA. As long as capital flowed, everything seemed stable, but dependence made the country vulnerable to international crises. This was later demonstrated in the Great Depression from 1929 onwards, when American loans abruptly ceased and the German economy plunged into a new catastrophe. Despite these risks, the Dawes Plan provided a much-needed respite for the Weimar Republic. He stabilized not only the economy, but also the political climate. The years after 1924 went down in German history as the Golden Twenties, a phase of relative stability, cultural blossoming, and economic upswing. But beneath the surface, the memory of inflation remained alive, and the structural problems were not finally resolved. Chapter 19: The Long-Term Consequences of Inflation for German Society. The hyperinflation of 1923 was not only an economic disaster, but a deep cut in the collective consciousness of the Germans. Its effects reached far beyond the immediate stabilization by the Rentenmark and the Dawes Plan. It changed thinking, political attitudes, and social structures, and left behind a trauma that shaped the behavior of Germans for decades to come. First of all, there was the deep-seated mistrust of monetary values. Millions of people had experienced how their hard-earned savings were destroyed within weeks. Savings books, life insurance policies, and pensions had become worthless paper. This experience led to confidence in the stability of currencies being shaken. The fear of inflation remained a defining element of German financial awareness until the post-war period of the 20th century. As late as the 1950s and 1960s, people in Germany were still talking about the fear of inflation as a kind of collective memory. The middle class, which was considered the mainstay of society, was hit particularly hard. Their descent into misery led to deep uncertainty. Many academics, civil servants, small businessmen, and employees felt betrayed by the state and were looking for new political orientations. This sense of loss became an important factor in radicalization in the late 1920s and early 1930s. The belief that democracy could not protect its interests made the middle class more susceptible to extremist movements. Inflation also acted as a social divider. While broad strata became impoverished, a few were able to enrich themselves through speculation, currency trading, or the possession of tangible assets. This inequality poisoned the social climate. The inflation profiteer became a hate figure, a symbol of injustice and moral decay. Many people felt that the principles of decency and fairness had been suspended during this time. In the long term, hyperinflation led to a change in values. Traditional virtues such as thrift, diligence, and precaution had lost their meaning, as they could not save people from falling. Instead, risk-taking, flexibility, and rapid adaptation gained in importance. Some contemporaries spoke of a brutalization of society. Survival in chaos had promoted egoism and cynicism. Politically, inflation was a deep trauma for democracy. It had shown that the state was unable or unwilling to protect the property and economic existence of its citizens. This failure gnawed at the legitimacy of the Weimar Republic. Even if there was economic stabilization in the Golden Twenties, mistrust remained. In the minds of many people, the Republic remained associated with chaos, misery, and worthlessness. Inflation also had international consequences. It shaped the image of Germany as a country that was unstable and unpredictable, and at the same time as one that tried by all means to evade the burden of reparations. This perception determined the international relationship for years and made every negotiation fraught with mistrust. After all, inflation also had a cultural effect. It left its mark on literature, art, and collective memory. Novels, caricatures, paintings, and reports reminded us of these years of madness for a long time. The idea of wheelbarrows full of banknotes, worthless banknotes as toys, and bread prices in the billions became an integral part of the German culture of remembrance. The long-term consequences of inflation were therefore complex: economic, social, political, and cultural. It created a society that was deeply insecure, thus laying the groundwork for later developments. Without the experience of 1923, the history of the Weimar Republic and also the rise of radical forces in the 1930s can hardly be understood.
Chapter 20: Memory and Historical Significance of 1923 Inflation. The hyperinflation of 1923 has become more deeply engraved in the collective memory of Germans than many other events of the Weimar Republic. Although it lasted only a few months in its most extreme form, it came as a shock that marked generations. It became a symbol of the total loss of security, of the failure of the state, and of the fragility of order and prosperity. As early as 1923, the memory of inflation began to determine political and social thinking. Decades later, many families still told of the time when billions were paid for a loaf of bread, or wages were paid twice a day so that they did not immediately become worthless. These anecdotes became an integral part of family tradition. They gave inflation a mythical character, as a warning example of what could happen when a state lost control. Especially in the middle class, the memory of the loss of savings and pensions remained painfully alive. This trauma became a permanent attitude of mistrust towards inflation that had an effect far into the Federal Republic. The fear of currency devaluation later played a decisive role in German economic policy. It led to a particularly strict monetary policy that placed price stability above all else. Politically, too, the historical significance of inflation was enormous. Many contemporaries saw it as proof of the failure of Weimar democracy. The impression that the Republic was incapable of meeting the basic needs of its citizens weakened its legitimacy in the long term. This mistrust contributed to the fact that extremist parties such as the NSDAP found easier support in the 1930s. Although National Socialism was not in a direct line of inflation, the experience of 1923 was an important building block for political radicalization. Internationally, German inflation has become a cautionary example. Newspapers all over the world reported on the absurd scenes: wheelbarrows full of banknotes, wallpaper made of banknotes, prices that doubled every hour. These images shaped the image of Germany in the 1920s and became a global metaphor for economic chaos. Even today, the hyperinflation of 1923 is considered one of the classic examples of the collapse of a monetary system in economic research. In addition, inflation had a cultural significance. She influenced literature, art, and theater. Authors such as Thomas Mann, Bertolt Brecht, and Alfred Deblin dealt with the social and moral consequences. Caricatures and pictures documented the absurdities of everyday life. And the art movements of the New Objectivity reflected the disillusionment that these years had produced. Finally, the historical significance of the inflation of 1923 lies in the fact that it permanently changed the relationship of Germans to the state and the economy. Trust was destroyed for a long time, and skepticism about political promises was deeply rooted. In retrospect, inflation was seen as a lesson that economic stability is one of the most important foundations of political order. Today, the hyperinflation of 1923 is considered a key moment in German history. It shows how closely intertwined politics, business, and society are, and how quickly the collapse of a currency can shake the foundations of a state. Their legacy lives on in the German culture of stability, in the special appreciation for sound fiscal policy, and in the collective fear of inflation. Thus, the inflation of 1923 was not only a dramatic chapter of the Weimar Republic, but an event of lasting formative power, a trauma and a warning at the same time.